Thanks, Patrick. So we'd like to open it up for the floor to discuss for roughly 20 minutes. So start fielding for comments. Anyone? Kevin.
So, Peter, I'm glad you actually brought up the City We Need and Urban Thinkers Campus. I actually hosted one at the University of Toronto. Yes, that's right. The Inclusive Cities Summit. And we looked at how can we translate the new urban agenda into a Toronto context. But when I was going through that, I didn't necessarily see an alignment with the SDGs, or at least that was some additional work that I had to do. So I wonder if there's been some work that's done, perhaps I just haven't found it, that talks about the new urban agenda out of UN Habitat through like an SDG lens or SDG language. It just makes sense that naturally you would have, you know, different UN initiatives have shared language, et cetera.
Yeah, Anthony.
Here we go. Hi, so I was so glad to hear that we had someone from WAFUNA here, because I volunteer for the United Nations Association of the United States of America, so it's a subset of that organization. I wanted to just say briefly, more as a comment than a question to Professor Sachs and those others in the room, that this is a fantastic organization if anyone needs to get bodies for an event or something like that. Most of these are in several of our countries, and furthermore, they have just so, they're a student-run pretty much organization. They have so many students on campuses and so forth. And then in the US in particular, there's something called the Better World Campaign that I'm not so sure if you happen to connect with, Professor Sachs, but it has many of the same goals as the SDG USA. So after this, what I'll commit to doing, if anyone wants to highlight their work in the US within that context, and perhaps we can work together to bring it to the world, see what we can use, tap into this network to highlight all of our work. So.
Thank you. Gabriel?
Patrick, yo quería saber dónde están estas ciudades de Brasil donde reciben los inmigrantes. Repito, ¿sí? Yo quería saber dónde están estas ciudades de Brasil que ustedes hacen parcerías para los trabajos con los inmigrantes y cómo hacen para conseguir esto. De nuevo. ¿Cómo hacen para sensibilizar a las personas de las empresas para que puedan dar trabajo para estos inmigrantes? ¿Y la ciudad dónde están? ¿Ok?
Gracias. Any other comments, questions? Christopher?
Yes, I just want to intellectualize and conceptualize kind of the way I'm thinking about the movement forward with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and see if you all agree with this concept and maybe action steps within them. To me, I see really three parts. There's education about the actuality of the goals and what they mean. There's advocacy within governments and administrations and localities, and then there's the actual work of doing the goals within NGOs and organizations, et cetera. I want to see if we agree that like, those are kind of the main areas, if there's any other areas that are really within that understand it. And maybe, I don't know if it's helpful at some point, I think it'd be nice to start talking about the one things that really matter. Like we've talked about, Jeffrey Sachs said, you know, the one thing with education is to know the goals and to be able to name them, et cetera. But I wonder if it's helpful at this point to start thinking, what are the one things that our organizations, our entities need to do next within these constructs? One thing I'll say is, I think I've been talking about this all weekend, we need money. We need resources, and we need to mobilize those resources. I'm heavily experienced with raising money within North America, but I imagine there's resources globally as well. I think it'd be helpful if we created a database internally of where the money is and where we ought to go within foundations and individuals, since we're all in the same group. So that's one idea I want to propose, but I was wondering if there's any other one things that people think might be worth naming.
Clayton?
Yeah, just by show of hands in here, who has heard of the Climate Reality Project by Al Gore? Okay, not as many as I would think, but the Climate Reality Project by Al Gore really won him his Nobel Peace Prize, and it was basically a university effort originally to teach people about climate change. And he created his famous PowerPoint presentation of outlining what climate change is, and then he took it on the road. Well, he realized that there's a big gap between people that care about climate change and those who know how to talk about climate science. So the way that they decided to solve this was coming up with kind of like a camp. Basically, you go to an event and over 2 days, you are given books and a flash drive with a 500-slide presentation on it, and you learn about climate change. And you learn how to take that presentation, pull pieces out of it, and then be able to repeat the information talking about that. And it's had tremendous success in climate literacy. So one of the things in the second half of today is that many of us have organizations, many of us have friends that are in organizations and colleagues that we know. They are achieving the SDGs. They may not be talking about it, they're at least addressing the SDGs. So perhaps a solution could be creating something out of that same feather in the cap that Al Gore had, almost like a SDG incubator weekend, something like that, to say, oh, you're an NGO that works on getting drug-addicted people off the street and putting them back to work. Great. Come to this workshop. Let's train you on how to talk about the SDGs, what SDGs you're specifically hitting, and then have you gain literacy in that to be able to then go evangelize them as part of what it is that you're talking about. I'm sure that if we were to do an analysis of each one of our organizations in here, we would be hitting goals and targets that we didn't even know that we were hitting. And that would be very enlightening for many of us to see that kind of cross-pollination. Sure, then you could put this data into a database and all of these things, but I think that the initial aspect of SDG literacy for NGOs could be really helpful.
Thank you. Maybe we'll go back to the panel to answer some of the questions. So maybe Patrick, would you like to start, and then we'll take from there?
Yeah, sure. So to answer your question, we work in a number of cities all over the world. In South America, which I think is where our employment programs have been the most successful, as I said, in Chile and Brazil. We work in Santiago in Chile, and in Brazil, São Paulo, Porto Alegre, Cuiabá, Manaus, many cities. Brazil has the largest, proportion of our programs. And the way we operate is that each of these centers where we help, do the vocational training, the education, et cetera, are supposed to operate pretty autonomously from each other. So one might do something one way, one might do something the other way. So I think that the way, at least generally speaking, the way we engage businesses is on a very local level. So start with the businesses in the neighborhood, the businesses that are located around the center. And then maybe if you're in a large city like São Paulo, you may go to bigger names. So one of the companies we work with is Leo Madeiras, which I believe is a home improvement company. And they have a number of factories in São Paulo that have hired our migrants. And the argument I think we make in terms of why they should do this, sometimes like Leo Madeiras, they come to us because they want to, because they see a population that's desperate, and there's a moral kind of reason, a heartstring tug for them. In other cases, you can make pretty significant arguments about productivity, turnover, things that especially industrial companies struggle with. If you have a migrant who's desperate for a job and is willing to work really hard, he or she is a lot less likely to work for 5 months at a company and then quit. Whereas in a lot of industrial companies, they may have people work for very short periods of time and then move around constantly. So there are some economic arguments that you can make as well. But again, it really depends on the city and the people at the center speaking with the businesses in their area. So to answer your question, it depends on the location.
I'd like to actually go back to what Christopher was saying about funding and resources. A bit of an example from SDSN Youth was that in 2015 we did a campaign called Know Your Goals campaign. In 1 month we organised the campaign. We had over 300 events around a range of countries. I think it was over 80 countries, Sam. And 15,000 attendees, and we did it on $0. We also translated a number of materials into different languages to provide basic information and research for the events to be imparted to students. So I think there is a definite need for funding, but there's also the power of social media, the power of the internet, and power of technology that we could really utilize. So I'd like to kind of just open it to the floor again, just to talk about funding and partnering with organizations and not just necessarily relying on that fundraising aspect.
One of the problems about funds, right, and I've got a lot to say about this, but just one thing I want to put out there real quick is that grants are great. You know, you get them and you have to report back to the foundation that's issued your grant for you and those types of things, but you're pigeonholed to the way that the foundation believes you should go about solving the problem. Worse, the money eventually runs out and has terms to it. Very often donations from people who believe in you. Hopefully all of you are shaking the tin cup at your family and friends. Those should be your first line of supporters and then kind of go out from there. Well, that money will run out too. So over the last year, one of the things that we've really looked at is social enterprises. And how do we be an organization that creates a social enterprise, many of them, that has a revenue model built into it? We need to not be drawn away from the perspective of the for-profit industry. The reason that they rule the world is because they know how to make a cash flow. And very often that cash flow is not in line with the triple bottom line. It needs to be tweaked. But you know, business is not art or science. It's something with a set of rules, with winners and losers, and it needs not be a vessel of inequality and creating this chasm of the haves and the have-nots. So I just want to encourage everyone that I am right there with you in how badly we need funding to push these initiatives forward. But if you can make your initiative give someone a job, increase human rights and social equity for people, and heal the planet, then you're really talking.
Kevin?
So just a couple of quick comments, and I'll actually build on what Clayton talked about. One of the not-for-profits that I sit on the board for, we have a for-profit social enterprise that is wholly owned by the not-for-profit. And that's what we're doing to diversify our revenue streams away from being dependent on government. And I'm happy to expand on it further offline for anyone who's interested. Some of our projects are also funded by corporate donations, and they are unrestricted funds. So there's a lot of advantages of that versus sometimes the challenges that come with government funding with regards to admin and reporting. Again, I'm happy to expand on that for anyone's interest in how best to go about identifying and pitching for corporate sponsorship. The last thing I want to mention is actual partnerships. One of the hats that I wear is I actually teach at the University of Toronto at the Institute of Medical Sciences. And with regards to the funding that comes out of the School of Public Health, every health venture that's funded has not just the venture itself, but there must be a faculty co-PI, co-principal investigator, innovator, and a community member. And in this way, we're developing cross-sectoral partnerships and ensures that there's a diverse perspective and a broader community approach. And so that's one way that we have found to be really effective in engaging academic institutions as well as community stakeholders and obviously on-the-ground community agencies and organizations, many of which are run by people like yourself.
Peter?
Kind of going off of that and then back to your first question, which I'll kind of just assume to be about coherence across processes in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. The new urban agenda is the outcome document of the Habitat 3 conference. For those of you who don't know, it happened last November, and everyone was still kind of on this SDG high, and they were like, oh my goodness, we just committed to all of the SDGs, and now we have to commit to something more. But I mean, really, if you go through and look through, there are a lot of mentions across. So the SDGs obviously have SDG 11 on cities specifically, but if you go through those targets and indicators and then kind of cross-reference them with the new urban agenda, you do see a lot of things in the new urban agenda about access to water, access to energy, access to safe transportation, which relates to any number of other SDGs. So there isn't in the documents necessarily such specific mention of them, which is something we've been talking about a lot. We have a lot of people already doing the things, but now we just kind of have to rebrand them in the SDGs. And that's actually something the World Urban Campaign has been working on. I was just in Dubai for a conference. At the end of the month, we're launching the City We Need Action campaign, which specifically addresses that problem. We say, this is this cool urban solution. It relates to SDGs, multiple of them. So there is definitely that going on.
Just go to Adam. Before I do that, we have to break in about 5 or 10 minutes. Professor Sachs, actually, did you want to say something? Yep.
We worked really hard to get an SDG for sustainable cities. By itself, SDG 11. It could not be better for this agenda. It's clear. It stands on its own. It's a beacon to cities to take this up. It says Goal 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. It's got many wonderful goals. None of these SDGs is a policy. They're goals. You could not do better than have the goals in the shining light to say the cities are places for sustainable development. So I just want to encourage, you won't find in any of them a specific policy. These are outcomes. And they are to be used as levers for policy to say how to achieve sustainable cities, how to achieve the goals of ensuring affordable housing and basic services, safe, affordable, accessible, sustainable transport systems, inclusive and sustainable urbanization, strengthening and protecting culture, natural heritage, and so on. So it's really there, not even remotely not there, center. And a number of us worked really hard to make sure that cities were highlighted. I don't know how many speeches I gave about the need for a city's goal. So please, again, the invitation is use them. They're there. There's no shortage of ammunition for you to say this is what it takes to make sustainable development work in Toronto or any other place. But you have to make the policy agenda anywhere. These are not policies. These are statements of purpose. They're the telos. The technique, how to get from here to there, is about public policy, about mobilization, about organization, about context. These are the telos. This is the aims. And they're very clear in that and very helpful, I think.
Just to be clear, I mean, what I was really, I think, advocating for was more on, because of what Peter's role was, I think in kind of incorporating more of the SDG language in that, and it's great to hear that that's the work that's being done. I think just having that coherence in language helps from a branding perspective.
Kind of just following up from where Kevin left off, I think something that Canada's done a really, really good job at is funding health innovation. There's kind of this new model where they're putting a lot of the money they have towards investing global health into health impact investing, where they sort of back particular ventures. So they fund, I think, $100 million every so often into this organization called Grand Challenges Canada, and then they kind of shift a lot of their money into smaller kind of $500,000 to $1 million grants. So they have this kind of seed program, this transition to scale program. It's really interesting.
Thanks, Adam. If you'd like to join me in thanking the panel, we'll actually break for a few minutes just for a stretch, and then we'll come back so we can have more discussion. Thank you.